The night was thick with fog as Valerio drove along the desolate highway, his headlights piercing through the mist like searching fingers. He was a man of few words, preferring the solitude of the open road to the clamor of city life. Tonight, however, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a sense of impending doom that clung to him like the fog outside. As he navigated the winding road, Valerio couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see some sinister figure lurking in the shadows behind him. But the only thing he saw was the empty road stretching out into the darkness. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road, its back turned to him. Valerio slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt as he came to a stop just a few feet away from the mysterious stranger. Heart pounding in his chest, Valerio rolled down the window and called out to the figure. "Hey, are you okay?" He shouted, his voice trembling with apprehension. But there was no response, only the eerie silence of the night. With a sense of dread creeping over him, Valerio reluctantly stepped out of the safety of his car and approached the figure. As he drew closer, he could make out the outline of a woman, her long hair blowing in the wind like wisps of smoke. "Ma'am, are you lost?" Valerio asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Still, there was no reply. It was as if the woman was nothing more than a ghost, a specter haunting the lonely highway. Just as Valerio was about to reach out and touch her shoulder, the woman suddenly turned around, her face hidden in the shadows of the night. And then, in a voice that sent shivers down his spine, she spoke. "Help me," she whispered, her voice filled with desperation. "Please, you have to help me." Valerio's heart raced as he stared into the woman's eyes, a cold chill running down his spine. There was something unnerving about her gaze, something that made him want to turn and run back to the safety of his car. But despite his fear, Valerio couldn't bring himself to abandon the woman. There was a vulnerability in her eyes, a plea for help that tugged at his conscience. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. The woman took a step closer, her hand reaching out to grasp his arm with a strength that belied her fragile appearance. "They're coming for me," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "Please, you have to get me out of here before it's too late." Valerio hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with doubt and uncertainty. But then he remembered the oath he had taken as a paramedic, the promise to help those in need no matter the cost. "Get in the car," he said firmly, gesturing towards the passenger side door. "I'll take you wherever you need to go." Without another word, the woman climbed into the car, her presence casting a shadow over the interior like a dark omen. Valerio swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he put the car into gear and pulled back onto the road. As they drove through the night, Valerio couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat, every sound a whisper of danger. As they continued their journey through the darkness, Valerio's unease grew with each passing mile. The woman beside him remained silent, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if she were searching for something in the distance. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught Valerio's attention in the rearview mirror. He tensed, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as he watched a pair of headlights appear out of the darkness behind them, closing in fast. "We're being followed," Valerio muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. The woman beside him stiffened, her eyes widening with fear. "Who are they?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a terrified whimper. "I don't know," Valerio replied, his heart pounding in his chest. "But we need to lose them." With a sense of urgency, Valerio pushed the gas pedal to the floor, the engine roaring to life as the car surged forward into the night. The headlights behind them grew brighter, casting long shadows across the road as they closed in on their prey. But no matter how fast Valerio drove, the other car stayed hot on their tail, its headlights like glowing eyes in the darkness. Panic began to claw at the edges of Valerio's mind as he realized they were running out of options. Then, just as all hope seemed lost, they rounded a bend in the road and came upon a narrow bridge spanning a deep ravine. Without hesitation, Valerio slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt at the edge of the bridge. "We have to jump," he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. The woman beside him nodded, her eyes wide with terror, as she unbuckled her seatbelt and prepared to leap from the car. With a final glance at the headlights bearing down on them, Valerio took a deep breath and threw himself from the car, the wind rushing past his ears as he plummeted into the darkness below. As he fell, time seemed to slow to a crawl, each second stretching out into eternity. And then, with a bone-jarring impact, he hit the water below, the icy embrace of the river swallowing him whole. For a moment, everything was chaos. The rush of water in his ears, the pounding of his heart in his chest. But then, as he fought his way to the surface, he saw the woman's face staring down at him from the edge of the bridge above. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the river below. And then, with a final nod, she turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Valerio alone in the darkness. The night hung heavy over the small town of Crestwood as George climbed into his car. He adjusted his rearview mirror, checking his reflection, a nervous habit he couldn't shake. Tonight, he had to make this drive. It was an obligation he couldn't ignore, not after what happened. George's hands trembled slightly as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence of the deserted streets. He glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. He had promised himself he'd be back before then, but promises seemed fragile in the face of his fears. As he drove through the darkened streets, memories flooded his mind. The events of that fateful night replayed like a horror movie he couldn't escape. He tried to push them away, focusing on the road ahead, but they lingered, haunting him like ghosts in the night. It had started innocently enough, a gathering at a friend's house, drinks flowing freely, laughter echoing off the walls. But then, as the night wore on, things took a dark turn. Arguments erupted, tempers flared, and in the chaos, someone disappeared. George shuddered at the memory. He had been the last to see her, the fear in her eyes etched into his mind. He should have stopped her from leaving, should have insisted she stay, but he didn't. And now she was gone. The road stretched out before him, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. George gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. He had to find her, had to make things right, even if it meant facing his own demons along the way. With a determined nod, he pressed down on the accelerator, the engine roaring in response. The night drive had begun, and there was no turning back now. The further George drove, the thicker the fog became, swallowing the road ahead like a voracious beast. His headlights pierced the darkness, cutting through the mist with a feeble glow. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking his every move. The town faded behind him, giving way to desolate countryside. Trees loomed like specters in the fog, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. George's heart pounded in his chest, the silence of the night broken only by the sound of his own ragged breaths. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the middle of the road, causing George to slam on the brakes. His heart leaked into his throat as he stared wide-eyed at the shape before him. It was her, the girl who had vanished into the night. Without hesitation, George flung open the car door and raced toward her, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. But as he drew closer, he realized something was wrong. The girl stood perfectly still, her eyes vacant, her expression blank. "Are you okay?" George asked, his voice trembling with fear. But the girl didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge his presence. It was as if she were nothing more than a puppet, dangling from invisible strings. A chill ran down George's spine as he reached out to touch her shoulder. But before his fingers could make contact, the girl vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but an eerie sense of unease. George stumbled backward, his mind reeling with disbelief. What was happening to him? Was this some kind of twisted nightmare, or had he truly lost his grip on reality? With a shaky breath, he stumbled back to his car, his hands fumbling with the keys. He had to get out of here, had to escape this nightmare before it consumed him whole. But as he peeled away from the scene, the fog closed in around him, swallowing him whole. And in the darkness, George knew he was no longer alone. George drove on, his heart racing, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Every shadow seemed to conceal a lurking menace, every sound a whispered threat. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, that something sinister was lurking just beyond his line of sight. The road twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the heart of the night. His headlights cast long, eerie shadows on the trees that lined the roadside, their branches swaying ominously in the wind. George gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white with exertion. Suddenly, a figure loomed in the middle of the road, causing George to slam on the brakes once again. His heart thundered in his chest as he stared wide-eyed at the shape before him. It was her again, the girl who had vanished into thin air. This time, George didn't hesitate. He flung open the car door and raced toward her, his footsteps pounding against the asphalt. But as he drew closer, he realized something was different. The girl's eyes were filled with terror, her lips trembling with unspeakable dread. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "You have to help me." Without a second thought, George reached out and grabbed her hand, pulling her close. He could feel her trembling against him, her fear palpable in the night air. But before he could say anything, a voice echoed from the darkness, chilling him to the bone. "You shouldn't have come back, George," the voice said, dripping with malice. "You can't escape what you've done." George's blood turned to ice as he spun around, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing there, nothing but empty darkness stretching out into infinity. He knew then that he was trapped, caught in a nightmare from which there was no escape. With a desperate cry, George turned and fled back to his car, the girl's hand still clutched tightly in his own. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know how to escape the darkness that threatened to consume him whole. All he knew was that he had to keep driving, had to keep running, until the night released its hold on him. The road stretched out before George like a never-ending ribbon, twisting and turning through the darkness. He drove on, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his mind consumed by fear and uncertainty. The girl sat beside him, her presence a constant reminder of the horrors he had witnessed. As the hours passed, George's exhaustion grew, his body weary from the endless night drive. He struggled to keep his eyes open, his vision blurring with fatigue. But still, he pressed on, driven by a desperate need to escape the darkness that threatened to consume him. Suddenly, a blinding light pierced the night, illuminating the road ahead with dazzling brightness. George squinted against the glare, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the outline of a town looming in the distance, its streets bathed in the warm glow of streetlights. With a surge of hope, George pushed down on the accelerator, his car racing toward the safety of civilization. But as he drew closer, he realized something was wrong. The town seemed deserted, its buildings looming like silent sentinels in the night. Ignoring the voice of caution in the back of his mind, George drove deeper into the heart of the town, his pulse quickening with each passing moment. He had to find help, had to escape the nightmare that had consumed his life. But as he rounded a corner, he came face to face with the truth. The town wasn't deserted. It was a graveyard, its streets littered with the crumbling remains of forgotten dreams. And standing at the center of it all was the girl, her eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. "You can't escape, George," she whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. "You're mine now, forever." With a cry of despair, George slammed on the brakes, his car skidding to a halt in the middle of the deserted street. He knew then that there was no escape, no way to outrun the darkness that had consumed him whole.